We'll continue with a reading that I'm going to invite you to join with me in unison. It is number 563 in the readings at the back of the hymnal. Number 563. Let's read together. A person will worship something. Have no doubt about that. We may think our tribute is paid in secret in the dark recesses of our hearts, but it soon will out. That which dominates our imaginations and our thoughts will dominate our lives. And therefore it behooves us to be careful what we worship. For what we are worshiping, we are becoming. Bless Ralph Waldo Emerson. Sometimes a reminder that we'd rather not hear. I'd like to invite you to just be with me in a moment of silence before I begin the sermon. Thank you. This has been a challenging week. There's no getting away from it. And the sermon is about change and transition and transformation. So I'd like to just think together with you a little bit about these processes that are going on constantly in our lives all the time. And largely whether we pay attention or not. And I've been thinking about it a lot. As we have witnessed our grandkids taking off for college again. Both kids have been away from their higher education careers for the duration pretty much of the COVID pandemic. Everything seems so long ago, but how everything got interrupted at the beginning of all this. So over the last year and a half or 2 years, we've really had the luxury of their presence in our lives as they've kind of weathered this gap. Weekly Monday lunches with our 20-something grandson on his day off from Morning Glory Farm have been an absolute unexpected joy and pleasure. And we've had frequent visits from our granddaughter, complete with intense conversations as only a 23-year-old can have over cups of tea in the middle of the day. But finally last week, with a car packed to the roof, our granddaughter headed out to Syracuse to begin her graduate studies. And tomorrow, in another car packed to the roof, our grandson is leaving for Montreal to resume his undergraduate work. We're uncertain about when we'll see them again. A big change is happening. We've all lived through the collective changes that have happened since the COVID pandemic began to shape our lives in ways we never could have imagined. Through the early months, the changes happened so rapidly that we could not keep up with them. Information was spotty. Rules kept changing as more information became available. The way we respond to the virus now has changed since vaccines have become available. Rapid change, and barely any time to attend to the work of transition before another change emerged. The result of this inability to pay attention to the emotional work of a transition process has resulted in anxiety, frustration, anger, uncertainty, all of that, coming to know about who we are and how we're going to move into the future together. William Bridges, the author of Transitions, Making Sense of Life's Changes, writes, whether we choose and plan for it, or it is thrust upon us, change brings both opportunities and turmoil. Fortunately, the change that comes with launching, or in our case, relaunching college students, is a change that can be anticipated and prepared for. The transition, however, The emotional, spiritual, and psychological process is another matter. Change is the actual physical event that happens. Something gets rearranged in our lives, like rearranging the furniture in the living room. But transition is the way we move through it, whether emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, doing the internal work that's required to adapt and adjust to what comes next. I think I can affirm with all of you that in the midst of all the pandemic, our lives continued to change in many other ways as well. New relationships and friendships have been formed, while others have ended or changed. Many of our daily routines have undergone change. Old friends have died. Babies have been born. For some, retirement has happened. Jobs have changed. Illnesses have been weathered. And for some, we've moved from one location to another. And I'm here to tell you, if you don't already know it, the process of aging brings so many changes. The list goes on. You'll identify for yourselves the changes that have happened or are happening in your own lives just over the span of the last 2 years, never mind all the history that's gone before. Susan Bridges, who co-authored the book with her husband, notes that collectively we are exposed to divisiveness increasingly, accentuated culturally, politically, socially. Instant communication exposes us to events anywhere in the world in minutes. Innovation and technological advances in all fields of endeavor require change and learning, close quote. So just think about the energy that it required for this congregation to figure out how to shift over to Zoom services at the height of the pandemic. And then to learn how to provide hybrid services as it became more possible for us to meet together again. And then just when we think things have stabilized, choir members test positive and things change again. It's a lot to absorb all at once while we continue to seek meaningful work and relationships and ministry together. A change always means an ending of some kind. Could be small, might pass unnoticed, or it could be huge. Many tumultuous endings have been precipitated by the onset of the epidemic. Even the simplest things, like the end of easy hugs, that impulse to reach out and embrace one another, or friendly handshakes, or thinking about heading into the Stop and Shop, you know? I was saying before how many times I've gotten halfway there from my car and said, oh, got the mask, got to go back. Even going out for lunch, a normally social, easy kind of thing, precipitates some kind of acknowledgement that change has happened. Susan Bridges observes that we have never before experienced the types of unprecedented and simultaneous changes that are occurring in our lives now. Disruptive changes are happening faster and they are more public. And there's a pervasive sense of uncertainty and anxiety. With all these changes, we are thrust into times of transition from one way of being and relating to life to another way of being and relating to life. Even the changes set in motion by testing positive for COVID precipitate a transition. For this morning, that minor change meant letting go of expectations of how things would be for worship this morning. It meant coming to terms with and devising and then putting plan B into motion. It also meant moving through whatever anxiety and disappointment came with knowing the original plan, so carefully worked out, was not going to work. The transition from one set of expectations to another had to be almost instantaneous. In trust, the worship team, Andy, and all communicated via the ethers, and we let go of the existing plan and created a new one. It was in flux even this morning, I think, as we came in, because we had electronic music for some things, and then Andy filled in with some live music, which was such a blessing. All of that happened in trust. And trust is such a strong component of transition, because it's trust as we move through that allows us to move towards transformation. Change changes us, whether we know it or not, and whether we like it or not. As this sermon process was taking shape across this past week, I couldn't help being aware of the changes that are happening in the life of this particular community as we anticipate a new minister. And as many of us ponder the dramatic change that's happened in the life of one of our community members. Barbara referred to the Engler family a little bit earlier, struck by a disastrous, what do they call it, catastrophic medical situation. Change, whether sudden or gradual, as I said, inevitably means an ending. And an ending signifies that something has died. A way of being, a way of knowing who we are, a way that has been familiar, a way of doing things that we just take for granted. An ending sets in motion a process of grieving, whether acknowledged or not. Every ending sets in process a grieving of the loss that was. Even if the change that is made is one that we've chosen to make, we're still ending something that needs to be acknowledged as no longer existing. Every ending sets in motion a transition to something new and different, sometimes dreaded, sometimes celebrated, but definitely something strange and new. When a sudden event of change, like a catastrophic illness, strikes, as has struck the Engler family, the immediate aftermath is one of chaos and paralysis, because all the rules of the game have changed. There are feelings of confusion, powerlessness, feelings of being overwhelmed and lost and without clear direction. And our very human and compassionate impulse is immediately to try to discern how to bring order out of that chaos. How can we help? What can we do? And sometimes the very best we can do is ride out the storm with those who suffer. We can offer our support, maybe assist with setting priorities for what lies ahead. There is practical work that needs to be done when a dramatic change happens. And sooner or later, the work of transition needs to happen. The work of paying attention to all the internal, emotional, and spiritual work, the turmoil that happens inside us, needs to happen as both the community and the person who is suffering experience the way in which the change has changed them. This is hard work. It requires a tremendous amount of energy. Safe conversations need to happen about what has ended, what in effect has died, what will never be the same again after the change event has happened, what needs to be mourned. These losses need to be named. And it's in the process of summoning up the strength and the courage to tend to the pain and the disruption with a conscious intention. It's through all this that we work our way through the transition to life on the other side of whatever the catastrophic change has been. Without necessarily taking responsibility for fixing things, because we can't, the church community can be a place of grounding and support for the transition process when folks are going through a strenuous personal change. Bridges suggests that in some way we need to enter a sort of neutral zone, allowing ourselves to become quiet in the midst of the change. The image that comes to mind is one from the Buddhist tradition, and it's that of sitting at the bottom of a muddy pond, waiting for the mud to settle, waiting for the water to become clear. Cultivating a quiet center so that the inner response to the change has a chance to emerge. A church community can do this. In the midst of or in the aftermath of the most strenuous change, the spiritual community can gather itself, allow itself to become quiet, and to rest in the trust and embrace of faith. This is one of the gifts of our gathering as a fellowship and inspiration each week. This hour allows us to sit in the mud, opening ourselves up to the metaphors of the tradition, breathing a bit together, masked, of course, and giving ourselves a chance to see clearly what needs to come next once the mud has settled. Working through the feelings of uncertainty, of loss, of powerlessness to clearly see what we need to do. When we do it together, we are doing the work of transition. And on the other side, we become stronger, a more intentional community. We are transformed into something new, maybe something a little more refined than what we were before. In just 2 more weeks, another change, this one anticipated and planned for. Janet Newton will be your new minister, standing here in this pulpit. A new minister who lives on the island and is raising her family here. Something that hasn't happened in quite the same way before. It's a change that brings hope and excitement. But positive change also needs a transition time. Conversations may need to be held about what kind of loss is felt with the departure of Reverend Rob. What changes happened in the life of the congregation during his year that need to be celebrated? What attachments to what has been need to be let go? What loyalties and trust need to shift? What, in effect, has died or needs to die in order for a transition to a new phase in the life of this congregation needs to happen? What is left unfinished that needs attention? Is there baggage still hanging around from changes in the past that may affect the current process of change and transition? In effect, doing the work of transition means letting go of what was, mourning it, forgiving it, celebrating it, but letting it go in order to create space for whatever new thing life is about to offer. In a community of faith, this means communicating with one another, naming together what's experienced as loss, sharing concerns, excitement, anticipation, talking about what needs to be acknowledged and spoken about together in a loving and compassionate way in order for the transformation, for the transition to lead to transformation. One of my favorite images for transition comes from the labor and delivery room. Near the end of labor, the mother giving birth goes into what is called the transition phase. It's strenuous, and it taxes the mother almost beyond her endurance. If scenes from Call the Midwife are accurate, transition is often the time when the birthing mother decides she can't do it. She wants to quit, want to go home. I'm done here. She may rail at the father, blaming him for all the pain and suffering that she's going through. The good news is that the transition phase is the shortest phase of labor, and it signals that birth is imminent. And on the other side of the transition is a new life, brand new, full of possibility. Working our way through endings that come with every change, large or small, leads us to working our way through the transition. The work of transition is a spiritual one, demands that we pay attention to what's going on internally, spiritually. Careful and honest communication is critical. As we process the change, doing that together where we can to keep talking about it, processing it, trusting each other enough to converse honestly about what's happening to us because of the changes that are going on in our lives as individuals and as a community. We can allow ourselves to let go of what has ended, to grieve what is lost, to celebrate what remains, to anticipate what is new. This is what allows us to move forward together as a transformed people. May it be so. Amen. For our closing words, I would like to read portions of a poem called Nishmat by Marge Piercy. And Nishmat has the connotations of breathing, breath, soul, spirit. It's a Hebrew word. From Marge Piercy. We stand in the midst of a burning world, primed to burn with compassionate love and justice, to turn inward and find holy fire at the core, to turn outward and see the world that is, all one flesh with us, see under the trash, through the smog, the furry bee in the apple blossom, the trout leaping, the candles our ancestors lit for us. Fill us as the tide rustles in the reeds in the marsh. Fill us as the rushing water overflows the pitcher. Fill us as light fills a room with its dancing. Let the little quarrels of the bones and the snarling of the lesser appetites and the whining of the ego cease. Let silence still us so that we may see the great holy shining, and we can call out of that stillness and rise and praise.